Interestingly enough, the main account that we have of the Maid of Ludimir, which most writers and scholars quote, was an article that originally appeared in Russian in 1909 and then in Hebrew in 1923 by Shmuel Abba Horodetsky. Horodetsky was a scholar who wrote a lot about the history of Hasidut, about the Hasidic movement. And why is that date important? Because the Maid of Ludimir apparently was born in 1806. So the first written story source we have about her is from 1909, which is some 20 years after she passed away. And that's why it's very difficult to separate the facts from the legend regarding the Maid of Ludimir. And that is why Dr. Nathaniel Deutsch devoted this entire book of 300 pages called The Maid of Ludimir, appeared 10 years ago, in which he tried to separate the fact from the fiction, and he also discovered some archival documents that no one had ever seen before. Since we don't have time, I'm not going to try and summarize his 300-page book. I'm just going to share with you the primary source we have about the Maid of Ludimir, which is written by Shmuel Abba Horodetsky from 1909. And this is what he says. He says that she was born apparently around the year 1815. We now know that it was some 10 years earlier in the Volhynian town of Vladimir or Ludmir. From an early age, she attracted attention by her beauty and unusual mental abilities. She studied the Bible in the original and learned to write Hebrew, progressing to the study of Talmudic Agadah, Midrash, and Halachic works. This is not in your source sheet. She distinguished herself also by extraordinary piety, praying with ecstasy 3 times a day, like a man. As soon as she came of age, she was betrothed to a young man from her native city whom she had known and loved since childhood. However, once the engagement was announced, she was forced by custom to stop all contact with her groom until the wedding. This distressed the maid, and she gradually withdrew from society. During this period, her mother died, and she began to isolate herself completely. She would spend entire days alone in her room, going out only to visit her mother's grave. On one of these visits in the cemetery, she fell into unconsciousness, followed by a prolonged and mysterious illness from which she eventually recovered, endowed, as she said, with a new and elevated soul, a new neshama. She broke off her engagement and declared that she would not marry because she had transcended the world of the flesh. From that time on, she adopted the full rigor of male ritual observance, which means that she wore talit and tefillin every day, and absorbed herself in study and prayer. When her father died, she used her considerable inheritance to build a new Beit Midrash in Ludmir, where she lived in complete seclusion. She soon acquired a reputation for saintliness and miracle working, and became known as the Heilige Ludmira Moi, the Holy Maid of Ludmir. Men and women from the neighboring localities, among them scholars and rabbis, began to flock to her court. She would not allow anyone into her room, but would address her teachings and blessings from behind the closed door to the many followers gathered in the adjacent room every Saturday at the third Shabbat meal at Sudash Lishit. While her popular following grew, the response of the famous male tzaddikim of the region was negative, in other words, her competition. Some said that an evil or unclean spirit was speaking through her. Pressure was put on the maid to abandon the practice of tzaddikism and resume her rightful female role in marriage. Rabbi Mordechai of Chernobyl, who was a famous tzaddik at the time, and they brought the case to him, and he was reported to have said, quote, "We do not know which famous tzaddik soul has transmigrated into this woman, but it is hard for the soul of a tzaddik to find peace in the body of a woman." End of quote. Through his intervention, she finally agreed to marry. But the marriage was never consummated and soon ended in divorce. She married again but divorced once more, remaining a maid to the end of her life. Her marriages, however unsuccessful, did have the desired effect of putting an end to her career as a tzaddik, and her following declined sharply. You see, once she was married, she was no longer a tzaddik. She spent her last years in the Holy Land, where she died in obscurity in old age. This is basically what Horodetsky says, which has been repeated by innumerable authors in various publications in Hebrew and in English. Some of them add other interesting details. For example, some say that when she moved to Eretz Yisrael sometime in the middle of the 19th century, she developed a large following in the land of Israel. And according to one tradition, during her final years in the Holy Land, she was apparently involved, together with an old Kabbalist, in a private and abortive attempt to bring about the advent of the Messiah. As you can see, she didn't succeed. So these are some of the things that we know about the Maid of Ludimir. She was basically, we would say in our terminology, she was basically a Hasidic Rebbe. All of these activities being described about her are the activities that your standard Hasidic Rebbe in Eastern Europe performed. Seclusion in a room, people coming to ask her advice, passing the pitka, the little kvittel through the door. The Rebbe says what to do, or the Rebbe recites a prayer, or says which chapter of Tehillim to recite, engaged in prayer and study all day. In other words, she had basically, I don't know that if a soul had transmigrated through her, she had basically, after this vision or after this state that she had in the cemetery, she became a Hasidic Rebbe. And basically, according to all of these reports that are repeated in all these different books, she basically decided that she was a man. She was no longer a woman who needed to get married. She would wear talis and tefillin, and she would behave like a man, like a Rebbe. And since she was very learned and pious to begin with, apparently that transition was relatively simple for her. So here we have an example, I wouldn't say a role model, but an example of a woman, a Hasidic woman, who became a Hasidic Rebbe in the 19th century. By the way, she is not the only one. She is simply the most famous of them. And this, one could claim, is the beginning of women in the rabbinate in the 19th century in Eastern Europe. The second example is on the source sheet in front of you. And this I wrote about briefly in my new book, The Status of Women in Jewish Law, which I urge you to buy. Not because I receive royalties, I don't, but because I think it's an important book for everyone sitting in this room to read. And the introductory essay, which I delivered at this conference a number of years ago, is a survey of women in Jewish law from 1845 into 2010. So some of these episodes that I'm going to discuss here at length, I discussed briefly in the first introduction to the book. And this is the story of Rivka Hina. Rivka Hina was from an illustrious family. She was a granddaughter of Rav Chaim of Volozhin, who's one of the leading lights of Eastern European Jewry. Rav Chaim of Volozhin was the Talmid Muvhak, a devoted disciple of the Vilna Gaon. And she was married to Rabbi Eliezer Halevi of Grodno, who was a well-known rabbi at the time in Eastern Europe. Dr. Brenda Bacon, in an article of hers in the Nashim journal that we published in 2008, she referred briefly to this episode, and I went and looked up the Yiddish original of this episode. And this is an autobiography written by Yechezkel Kotik, which was originally published in Warsaw in 1911. I Xeroxed the Berlin edition of 1922. Yechezkel Kotik was an Eastern European Jew who obviously had a phenomenal memory. This is his autobiography written in 1911, in which he describes in great detail everything that happened to him beginning around the year 1845. And it's a very important source for Eastern European Jewish history, because he basically remembered everything that happened to him. And he also describes it in a very interesting fashion. And there is now a complete English translation of this autobiography, published by Wayne State University Press, and there is a Hebrew edition published by Tel Aviv University, both of them done by Professor David Asaf. And what it says here in the paragraph in the Yiddish that I marked here is he's talking here about his grandmother Rivka Hina, and he says that the Rav, her husband, would sit in his room with a closed door learning, and there was a small little window in the door which he would open, and when his wife, the Rebbitzin, ungeklappt, when she knocked on the door, when women came with a shaila, and most of the shailot had to do with whether a particular chicken is kosher or treif. Hat die Rebbetzin ausgehört die Scheile und übergegeben dem Mann durch ein Tierle und hat schon dabei gepasst. Right? She would hear the Shaila, she would give the Shaila to her husband. I think she would also pass the chicken through the little hole in the door to her husband. Als es ist gewesen a treife Shaila, oder a Shaila mit Eufos, pflegt ihm die Rebbetzin der langen durch ein Tierle dem Objekt von der Shaila. Right? She would pass through the door the object of the question. Und hat übergesehen und gepasst. And he saw the chicken and he gave the psak. The Rebbetzin is showing the Rebbe given a größer Boki in Shailas. She became an expert in questions of this nature, and she began to answer the questions herself. And now we get to the key paragraph. Der Mann pflegt sie äußern und ausproben. Her husband gave her a test, gave her an exam. Und später hat hier ausgegeben smicha zu paskinen die geringen Scheiles. And he then gave her smicha to paskin the more simple questions. Sie hat euch gekonnt gut lernen a Blatt Gemara. She also knew how to study a Blatt of Gemara, a page of Talmud very well. Men hat sie gehalten afilu fara lamden. People even considered her a lamden. In Eastern Europe, if you wanted to give someone a compliment, you said they were a lamden, right? A lamden is a lamdan, right? A person who is learning. In other words, not only could she answer questions about treif chickens, she also knew how to learn a Blatt Gemara. But the key phrase here, which is what drew the attention of Brenda and other scholars, the key phrase here is it says that her husband, sometime before the year 1853, gave her smicha. So this may be the first time in history, or maybe the second time, but I won't go into the earlier episode for the 17th century. This may be the first time in history when a Jewish man or a Jewish rabbi gave a woman smicha, specifically for the purpose of paskining shilas, of answering questions about the kashrut of chickens. Which, of course, today may not seem like a relevant topic, but at that time that was a very important job for a rabbi in Eastern Europe. And any story, novel, historical account you read of Eastern European Jewry, that was a standard feature of life. People bringing their chickens to the rabbi for a psak as to whether the chicken is kosher or not. So we see here the first two examples that we've given of women rabbis, one a Hasidic Rebbe, and the other more of a Litvak Rav, were both Orthodox women living in Eastern Europe in the first half of the 19th century. The other examples that we will give are mostly from the United States. And now we will make a drastic switch over to the city of Philadelphia in the year 1889. And if you look at the next page in your source sheet, it's labeled number 2. Mary Cohen, nice Jewish name. Mary Cohen was a Jewish journalist who lived in Philadelphia in the 19th century. She published quite a bit, and she was a member of Mikveh Israel, which is a very famous historic Sephardic synagogue in Philadelphia. And in 1889, she published a story in the Purim edition of the Jewish Exponent. Why did she specifically publish it in the Purim edition? I think that was not an accident, because I think what she said was so unusual or strange for her time. She purposely did it in the Purim edition, and the name of the story is A Problem for Purim. In other words, this is a fictitious story. But we'll see in a moment that the fictitious story came true almost 1 year later. So this was on the front page of the Jewish Exponent in Philadelphia on Purim 1889. And the story is about a promising young man, Lionel Martinez, who is preparing for the rabbinate. A few days before Purim, he invites a group of friends to discuss Jewish affairs. The topic for discussion is, quote, ministers and their work, end of quote. Rabbis in the 19th century were also called ministers. And initially the talk revolves around sermons and the possibility of exchanging pulpits in the hope that this might offer some vitalizing influence. This is now on the sheet that I Xeroxed for you. Then a young woman, Dora Ullman, superintendent of a local sewing school, speaks up, warning that her words will shock you considerably. And remember, this is a short story. This is not a newspaper account. She blushed a little, then made a desperate plunge into her subject. Could not our women be ministers? All but Lionel were struck dumb. Even Jack's boasted calmness had taken flight. He sat in open-eyed surprise. Martinez said quickly, "Will you explain your idea or plan, Miss Dora?" He was, however, secretly a little astonished. He had not expected anything from her until later on, and then views on sewing schools. He thought that's what Dora would talk about. "It seems to me," said Dora in response, "that there are trails in the lives of women that men do not and cannot understand. About these our sex could probably preach and teach better than men could. At present, men minister to both sexes, and why should women not do the same? Of course, I do not mean that women should supersede men in the pulpit, but the profession should be open to women too." Where did this come from? Or as they say in Hebrew, Minayin zeba. Where did she get this idea from? Apparently she got this idea from the fact that in the late 19th century there were many Christian women preachers in various denominations, such as the Unitarian Church. The Church of Christian Science had been founded by Mary Baker Eddy. I always get the three names mixed up. In other words, this was something that was growing in influence in American society in the latter half of the 19th century. Women ministers, women preachers. Apparently that's where she got the idea from. I doubt that she got the idea from Rivka Hinna, whom no one had ever heard of. And I doubt she got the idea from the Maid of Ludomir. I think that she was influenced by the local situation in Philadelphia or in the United States in the latter half of the 19th century. Of course, this is merely a short story. And in a short story, in a novel, people can say whatever they want. The fascinating thing about this is that really, the very next year, this short story began to happen. And it happened through the life of a woman who is known as Ray Frank. Her real name was Rachel Frank, but everybody calls her Ray Frank. And Ray Frank had many, many nicknames throughout her short 11-year career as a pseudo-rabbi. For example, she was called the Girl Rabbi of the Golden West. As I'm going through this, I'll mention some of the other things that she was called. I'm not derogatory. She just was called by various terms. Ray Frank was born in San Francisco in 1861, the daughter of Polish immigrants. She came from a traditional Jewish family that claimed descent from the Gaon of Vilna. Of course, that's not unusual. Half the Jews in the world claim descent from the Gaon of Vilna. It's a very popular Jewish occupation. She completed her education in a California public school, high school. She became a teacher in the silver mining town of Ruby Hill, Nevada. She returned to Oakland, California, studied some philosophy at Berkeley, and began teaching what was called Sabbath school. In May of 1890, she wrote a lengthy letter to the editor of the Jewish Messenger, which was a well-known newspaper there at the time. The Messenger had asked the readers to consider, what would you do if you were a rabbi? Responding to her own question, what would I not do if I were a rabbi? Ray Frank seized the opportunity to decry the materialism of the rabbinate, the mixing of religion and politics, the selling of religion in the form of pews and benches to the highest bidder, and unbridled animosity between Reform and Orthodox rabbis. Does any of this sound familiar? 1890. She concluded, women are precluded from entering the Holy of Holies, but it is great satisfaction to contemplate what we would not do were the high office not denied us. 4 months after writing this letter, Ray Frank basically assumed the high office. And this happened because she became a correspondent for several local newspapers. And on the eve of Yom Kippur, 1890, she was in Spokane, Washington. Learning that there were to be no high holiday services in the city, she approached one of the influential Jews there. He agreed to arrange for services if she would agree to preach. she did to a packed Spokane Falls Opera House. And I Xeroxed for you part of her sermon, which is pages 3 and 4 of this little handout. This is part of the sermon delivered by Ray Frank in the Opera House of Spokane, Washington, Yom Kippur, 1890. And I'm starting in the middle of page 3, which I marked with a bracket. My position this evening is a novel one. From time immemorial, the Jewish woman has remained in the background of history, quite content to let the fathers and brothers be the principals in a picture wherein she's shown only by a reflected light. And it is well that it has been so, for while she has let the stronger ones do battle for her throughout centuries of darkness and opposition, she has gathered strength and courage to come forward in an age of progressive enlightenment and do battle for herself if necessary, or prove by being a noble helpmeet how truly she appreciates the love which shielded her in the past. And she goes on to say, to talk about the current state of Judaism, and again what she says unfortunately sounds very familiar. This is a progressive age, and some of the customs of 2,000 or 3,000 years ago will not do for today, and at the same time many customs that were good then are just not good now. Are just as good now, It would be well for you to throw aside all little disagreements and unite in the one cause, that of upholding the creed of our religion. Do not persuade yourself that coming to shul once or twice a year, or fasting for 24 hours will make you a good Jew. This is a sermon I give every year in Chutz La'aretz. Do not comfort yourself with the belief that God will in the 11th hour accept your tithe, which you pay because you must. For 363 days you are content to go your way, doing as you please, piling up the coin of the United States, and congratulating yourself that your credit is good. You never give a thought to the one from whom all blessings come, until reminded that Rosh Hashanah is here and Yom Kippur will follow. Oh, the growls that come because the store must remain closed for 2 days. Perhaps you refuse to close it at all. Oh, the shameful, ungrateful sneers and remarks by the too reformed to be good once. Friends, you are making a mistake. For such as I have mentioned, it would be better to keep the store open. The sin would not be so great. Religion is not compulsory. God wants not grudgingly that which you give. Keep it, you cannot be poorer than you are. Whatever you do for religion or whatever you give must be voluntary and sincere. Coming here because your neighbor does is not religion. Neither is it religion to give a certain amount because your neighbor has done the same. True religion is true repentance for our many sins and mistakes. And finally, with the last paragraph, friends, I thank you for the patience with which you have listened to me, and in the name of all we Hebrews hold most dear, I ask you to be patient with each other. Drop all personal feelings in the matter, and meet each other halfway over your differences. Give each other a hearty handshake for the sake of the cause, and I prophesy heaven will crown your efforts with peace and prosperity. From tonight on, resolve to be something. Very interesting sermon. She talks here about Ben Adam Lamakom, Ben Adam Lachavero, commandments between man and God, between man and man. She was obviously a very good speaker, which is proven by her subsequent career. For the some 11 years that she preached, she became a celebrity. She was written about in the New York Times and every other major newspaper at the time. And interesting enough, if you read her sermons, she really was not a very learned person. She had not received a thorough Jewish education. She tried a little bit to remedy that situation. And in January of 1893, she went to Cincinnati to study at Hebrew Union College, which is, of course, the Reform Rabbinical Seminary, which had been founded some 20 years before in Cincinnati. She was already about 30 years old, and she had no intention of matriculating a rabbinical school. Rather, as she wrote, I'm quoting her words, I entered the theological college in Cincinnati in order to learn more of the philosophy of Judaism, and was the first woman to take that special work at the college. It never having been my intention to take the regular theological course, having long prior concluded that while theologies are many, religion is one, and that ordination is not essential to preachers, or better yet, to teachers. In other words, she did not want to become a rabbi. She only stayed there for a short time. She did receive some encouragement from Rabbi Isaac Mayer Weiss, who was the president of Hebrew Union College at the time. Weiss wrote, we glory in her zeal and moral courage to break down the last remains of the barriers erected in the synagogue against woman. In the laws governing the Hebrew Union College, the question of sex or race or confession is not touched upon at all. In other words, he's saying that according to the bylaws of HUC, anybody can study at HUC, even if you're not Jewish. We can only encourage Miss Ray Frank or any other gifted lady who takes the theological course to assist the cause of emancipating women in the synagogue and the congregation. As I said, she was a well-known figure at the time. She met many of the influential writers at the time, such as Ambrose Pierce, Israel Zangwill, some famous women writers. She did not ask for ordination. One of the things she wrote was, "What matter whether we women are ordained rabbis or not? We are capable of fulfilling the office, and the best way to prove it is to convert ourselves and our families into reverent beings." She was offered many pulpits, both for the high holidays and throughout the year, over the course of the years that she preached. She turned down all of the full-time jobs she was offered as rabbi. And in recent years, an article appeared entitled "The Girl Rabbi of the Golden West," written by two scholars, by Riva Klar and William Kramer, which I think the article was quite a bicorti. Thank you. Quite critical of Ray Frank. They say that the reason she was so famous in the 1890s was that she employed a publicist named Samuel Friedlander in Portland, Oregon, who was her manager. That is absolutely true. However, if you look at the career of women and male preachers in the late 19th century, they all employed managers. This was the way that people got speaking engagements at the time, including Antoinette Brown Blackwell, the first female minister, women's rights leader Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and so on and so forth. In other words, the fact that she employed a publicist should not be held against her. This was standard operating procedure in the 1890s. What happened to Ray Frank? She got married. The minute she got married, she stopped preaching. Her husband was a professor. She became a professor's wife. She lived until 1948. And as I said, in recent years, many scholars have written about Ray Frank. And if you look on the internet, you can find various sermons of hers that were delivered in the 1890s. The next woman we shall mention, who might have become a rabbi, had she wanted to do so, was none other than Henrietta Zold. Henrietta Zold was a remarkable woman, and of course she is known as the founder of Hadassah and for her work with Youth Aliyah. But I'm going to talk about a specific episode in her life. Henrietta Zold was born in 1860 in Baltimore. Her father was a rabbi in Baltimore. There were 8 daughters in the family. She was the oldest daughter. When her father, well, I'll get to her father in a moment. First, let's begin with the article from 1897. And I Xeroxed it for you, in front of you. In 1897, she was asked to participate in a newspaper symposium in a newspaper that was called The Reform Advocate, published by Rabbi Emil Hirsch, who was a very well-known rabbi at the time. 26 women participated in the symposium, and this is a short quote from what Henrietta Zold wrote in her article about women in the synagogue. "I believe that woman can best serve the interests of the synagogue by devoting herself to her home, and by occupying the pulpit only when her knowledge of the law, history, and literature of Judaism is masterful, and her natural gift so extraordinary as to forbid hesitation, though even then it were the part of wisdom not to make a profession of public preaching and teaching, the old Jewish rule of not holding women responsible for religious duties performed at definite times, having a deep-seated rational basis and wide applicability." In other words, the Deborahs and Miriams need not hide their light under a bushel, but they and the world must be pretty sure they are Deborahs and Miriams, not equally admirable Hannahs and Ruths. Very interesting. What she's saying here is that she thinks that the only woman who can become a rabbi is an extraordinary woman who has the leadership qualities of Deborah and Miriam. And even though Hannah and Ruth were great Jewesses and did very important things, they did very important things in a private, more woman-like fashion, perhaps in Henrietta Zold's eyes. But the number of women who could become a rabbi would obviously be a very, very small number, because those women would have to be extraordinary. Now, what happened to Henrietta Zold herself? Remember, this is 1897. A few years later, her father passes away. She moves, first to Philadelphia, then to New York, and in the year 1903, she enrolls to study at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. And many people in recent years who've written about women in the rabbinate have said that Henrietta Zold really wanted to study to be a rabbi, but the powers that be at the seminary wouldn't let her. That is not correct. Henrietta Zold did not want to be a rabbi. In other words, in light of what she had written in 1897, she apparently felt that she was not worthy of being a rabbi, that she wasn't extraordinary enough, even though, of course, she was extraordinary. But obviously that's a subjective assessment. And she did not ask to study at the seminary in order to become a rabbi. Her motive for going to study at the seminary was that she wanted to edit her father's papers, and she felt that she didn't know enough rabbinics to do so. So she wanted to study at JTS in order to learn rabbinics. Her mother proposed that she ask Solomon Schachter, the new president of JTS, if she could become a student in the rabbinical school. Could she, when classes resumed in the fall of 1903, study there, quote, not to be a rabbi, simply to train herself for work on the manuscripts, end of quote. And Henrietta Zold, in February of 1903, discussed her plans to attend JTS in a letter to Judge Sulzberger, Mayor Sulzberger, who was a well-known Jewish leader at the time, and chairman of the Jewish Publication Society in Philadelphia, where Henrietta Zold served as the secretary. And this is what Henrietta Zold wrote. While in New York this week, I had a talk with Dr. Schachter about my entering the theological seminary as a student. After he was assured that I was not an aspirant after rabbinical honors, meaning that's what she told him, he agreed to put no obstacles in my way. It remains to be seen what the attitude of the seminary authorities will be. A week later, she received a letter from Cyrus Adler, then president of the board of the seminary. He told her that Schachter could admit, quote, special students, not candidates for degrees, who in his opinion are capable of profiting by instruction given in the seminary. Nonetheless, when she started to study at the seminary in 1903, the newspapers reported on this fact, because it was unusual for a woman to be studying in a rabbinical school. And in 1904, she noted with glee the consternation that her studies had aroused as reporters of the Yiddish press claimed that she planned to use her training to do what rabbis traditionally do, to rule on questions of Jewish law. So even though that she herself said that she was not enrolling in order to become a rabbi, the newspapers already reported that she wanted to paskin shilas, that she wanted to become a rabbi and rule on questions of Jewish law. So we see here that on the one hand, Henrietta Zold was a remarkable woman, certainly one of the most knowledgeable Jewish women in America in her day, the editor of the Jewish the secretary and editor of the Jewish Publication Society. She enrolled at JTS not to study to be a rabbi, but to study rabbinics, and she herself said that only a very extraordinary woman could become a rabbi. Now, you may say, or you may conclude from this, that Henrietta Zold was not a, quote, Jewish feminist, end of quote, since the term didn't exist in the year 1903. I would say that that is not true. What I showed in my book, The Status of Women in Jewish Law, pages 9 and pages 253, is that, first of all, when Henrietta Zold made Aliyah to Israel around 1920, she founded the first egalitarian minyan in the history of the State of Israel. And if you want more details about that minyan, see page 9. In addition, I quote in the book that when her father passed away, remember there were 8 daughters, a number of people volunteered to say Kaddish for her father. She refused. She said, "This is my father. I'm going to say Kaddish for my father and not pay someone else to say Kaddish for my father." And if you want to read a beautiful quote, it's on page 253. She explains there to a male friend of hers why she wants to recite Kaddish and is not asking him to do so in her stead. So clearly, in terms of Jewish feminism, she was a Jewish feminist. She was ahead of her time. But in terms of a woman becoming a rabbi, she did not think that that was a normal or desirable option in the year 1897 or 1903. We now skip to the year 1921 to 1923, and this is not on the sheet in front of you. And this is the story of Martha Newmark. Henrietta Zold was a rabbi's daughter. Abigail, is she here? Abigail Gretz. She published a novel recently, Bat Harav, the rabbi's daughter, here in Israel. The next woman we're going to talk about was also a rabbi's daughter. Her name was Martha Newmark. Martha Newmark lived from 1904 to 1981. Her father was a professor of Jewish philosophy at HUC, Professor David Newmark. And Martha Newmark moved to the United States as a young girl at the age of 3, 1907, with her family. She grew up in Cincinnati, but already in high school she studied for 3 years at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. She studied Bible, Hebrew, Aramaic, rabbinics, liturgy, and Jewish history. She had no intention of becoming a rabbi. It was sort of a Hebrew high school type program. It was called the Hebrew Union College Preparatory Division. So what happened? Every summer her family would spend the summer at a Michigan resort, and her father served as a rabbi there for the people on vacation. One Friday night, he turned over the conducting of the entire service, except for the sermon, to 16-year-old Martha Newmark. And she later wrote, it was as I encanted the Hebrew that the witchery and charm of the service surged through me. Beautiful English. In other words, she decided slowly but surely, starting at the age of 16, that she wanted to become a rabbi. So after having studied intensively Jewish studies for 3 years, she wanted to have a high holiday pulpit. Not as a rabbi, but as a para-rabbi, a proto-rabbi. So what did she do? She asked Hebrew Union College to place her as a rabbi for the high holidays. Not as a regular rabbi, just for the high holidays. Well, this led to a tremendous brouhaha, as they say in American English. And Kaufman Kohler, the president of Hebrew Union College, began a process that took 2 entire years of debate. Remember, she just wanted a high holiday pulpit. She didn't want to study for the rabbinate yet. And it became a snowball that perhaps out of all proportion to the question that she had asked. And the debate lasted for 2 years, and in this book by Professor Pamela Nadell, Women Who Would Be Rabbis, she spends 10 pages describing the history of this episode, which was only 2 years long. And it involved the faculty of Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, the entire faculty. It involved the CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which was the entire rabbis' union of Reform rabbis in the United States. And ultimately, it involved the board of Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. Who were the protagonists? On the one side, you had Professor Jacob Z. Lauterbach, who was a very famous Talmudist who had grown up in Eastern Europe, a tremendous Talmid Chacham. Lauterbach, for those of you who like esoterica, published a very famous essay on the history of Tashlich. It's 120 pages long. The essay is much longer than Tashlich. And in addition, he published the classic English translation of the Mechilta, which is the Tannaitic Midrash on the Book of Shmot, in the 1920s, a 3-volume translation, which is still the standard translation until today. So Professor Lauterbach became the antagonist, the one opposed to ordaining women as rabbis. And one of the main protagonists was none other than Professor David Newmark, who happened to be Martha's father. And he was not a Talmudist, he was a philosopher, but obviously he wanted to support, perhaps not obviously, he wanted to support his daughter and help her first to have a high holiday pulpit and then to actually study for the rabbinate at Hebrew Union College. I'm not going to repeat all of the arguments pro and con about yes women rabbis, no women rabbis. You've heard many of them before. I'll just repeat a few of the standard arguments that Professor Lauterbach gave. And by the way, this is not in one publication, it's in a series of publications. For example, he talked about the fact that women are only chayav b'mitzvot aseh shazman grama. The women are only required to do positive, are not chayav, are not required to do positive time-bound commandments. And one who is not personally obliged to perform a certain duty cannot perform that duty on behalf of others. Consequently, women could not become religious leaders. The Talmud took this for granted, medieval sages upheld it, and this view remains strictly adhered to by all Jewry all over the world throughout the generations, even unto this day. Lauterbach further said, quote, "Shall we adhere to this tradition, or shall we separate ourselves from Catholic Israel and introduce a radical innovation?" Which, of course, is a little bit ironic, considering some of the things that the Reform movement had done in the 100 years prior to Rabbi Lauterbach writing this responsum in 1922. For example, Reform rabbis had done away with circumcision, Reform rabbis had moved Shabbat to Sunday, Reform rabbis had done away with the get, which means that women were married but not divorced according to Jewish law, which of course leads to mamzerut. In other words, they had done things a lot more radical than this, and yet Rabbi Lauterbach is arguing that they should not disconnect themselves from Catholic Israel. Going beyond rabbinic sources, Lauterbach brought forward sociological realities. Women could not possibly enter the rabbinate as they did any other profession, for it was unique for its arduous demands. No woman could marry and raise a family and give the rabbinate the wholehearted devotion that it required. On the contrary, the successful rabbi required a helpmate for a wife, one to make his home a Jewish home, a model for the congregation to follow. No married woman rabbi could expect this from her husband. And remember, this is in 1922. Even if she found a man to take a subordinate position in the family and assist her, her family model would not provide a very wholesome influence for the congregation. Excluding women from the rabbinate in no way deprecated them. It merely affirmed the Torah's wisdom in assigning men and women their respective spheres. Women's sphere remained the home, where she reigned as wife and mother. In concluding, he returned to other new possibilities open to modern Jewish women. Thus, he saw no injustice done to women in upholding the rabbinate as a male preserver. Okay, these are some of the arguments that Lauterbach gave. Obviously, there were arguments on the other side of Rabbi Newmark, saying that a rabbi today primarily is not a dayan, is not a judge in Jewish law, does not paskin shilas. The main thing that a rabbi does is preach and teach, and there's no reason why a woman cannot do that. These were the main arguments that Newmark advanced. So what happens to this? So first it started out in the faculty of Hebrew Union College, where the majority of faculty said that it was permissible to ordain women as rabbis. Then it went to a conference of the CCAR in the summer of 1922. 56 rabbis participated in that conference, and the majority of them said that women could be ordained as rabbis. Interestingly enough, they opened up the floor to 3 women who were Rebbitzins, wives of rabbis at the conference, who also spoke for the record on this particular issue. So the CCAR voted, the vote was 56-11, that women cannot justly be denied the privilege of ordination. End of quote. So you may ask, was Martha Newmark ordained as a rabbi? The answer is no. Why? Because the board of the Hebrew Union College voted and said no. In other words, even though the faculty had voted in favor and the Organization of Reform Rabbis had voted in favor, the Board of Governors in February 1923 voted that 6-2, that no change should be made in the present practice of limiting to males the right to matriculate for the purpose of entering the rabbinate. And therefore, it would take another 50 years until the Hebrew Union College would have ordained its first rabbi in the year 1972. I'm just trying to figure out how much time I have, given how many women I want to talk about. Okay, I want to talk at least about 3 more women. If we have time at the end, I'll add somebody in the middle. Let us skip to Helen Hadassah Leventhal, who is not on the source sheet in front of you. Anybody here originally from Brooklyn? Okay, did you hear of a Rabbi Leventhal? What was his name? Rabbi Israel Leventhal. He was the rabbi of the Brooklyn Jewish Center, if I'm not mistaken, for 66 years. Rabbi Israel Leventhal was a 12th generation rabbi. His daughter, Helen Hadassah Leventhal, wanted to be a 13th generation rabbi, but that was not to be. She lived from 1910 until 1989, and she was born and raised in the United States, got a Bachelor of Science in Education at the University of Pennsylvania. She started in 1932 to study at Columbia University and to audit courses at JIR. I have to digress a moment and explain what JIR was. The Jewish Institute of Religion. You may have heard of an institution today which is called HUCJIR. That is because in 1949, Hebrew Union College absorbed JIR. But between 1922 and 1949, the Jewish Institute of Religion was an independent rabbinical school run by Rabbi Stephen S. Weiss, who was one of the leaders of United States Jewry at the time, and he founded and ran his own rabbinical school. When he died, HUC acquired that rabbinical school, and it became HUCJIR. The Jewish Institute of Religion, when it opened its doors in 1922, at the very beginning began to discuss the subject of ordaining women as rabbis. Since I skipped that episode, I'm not going to talk about it right now. I'm now in the 1930s, and the story of Helen Leventhal. So she starts to study at JIR, the Jewish Institute of Religion in New York, in 1932. And at the beginning, she didn't want to be a rabbi. She wanted to study Torah. As she said herself, Torah lishma, Torah for its own sake. In 1935, she switched into the regular rabbinical program. In other words, she decided that she did want to become a rabbi. And in 1939, she finished the rabbinical curriculum. 2 years previously, the faculty at JIR had debated whether she could receive ordination, and all of them said no, except for one faculty member, Professor Shalom Spiegel, who was a professor of Hebrew literature, who later taught at JTS in New York, and you may be familiar with his brother. His brother was Sam Spiegel. But Professor Shalom Spiegel was a very famous and proficient professor of Hebrew and Jewish literature, who until today his students rave about as a teacher. He was the only one who wanted to ordain Helen Leventhal as a rabbi. This was in 1937. So here she arrives in 1938, 1939, and she's preparing her final rabbinic thesis, which was the standard thing that was done at the time in many of the rabbinical schools. And the subject she chose for her thesis was women's suffrage from halachic aspect. As you may know, women received the right to vote in the United States in the year 1921. Okay? At that time, throughout Europe, one by one, between 1917 and 1921, 22, most of the countries gave the women the right to vote, except for Switzerland. When did women receive the right to vote in Switzerland? 1970s. I don't remember the exact date. So in 1938, when she's writing her rabbinic thesis, this was still a hot topic in general society. Do women have the right to vote? And it was also a hot topic in halachic literature. Because from 1918 until 1920, there was a huge debate here in the land of Israel as to whether women had the right to vote. And every rabbi who was anybody wrote a responsum or an article on this subject. And one of the rabbis who wrote an article on the subject was her teacher at JIR, whose name was Chaim Chernovitz. His nickname was Rav Tzair. And Chaim Chernovitz was a very famous rabbi and educator who started out in Odessa, moved to New York, and taught halacha at JIR in New York. And he was her teacher. I'm going to tell you something else about him in a moment. So, since her teacher had written an article about whether women have the right to vote in halacha, she decides to write her final thesis on that subject. It consists of more than 100 pages. I have not seen the thesis, but it's described here by Professor Nadel. A very thorough halachic analysis as to the question of whether women have the right to vote. Remember, she's not asking the question here whether women can be ordained as rabbis. She was asking whether women have the right to vote. And not surprisingly, she arrives at the conclusion that women have the right to vote. And along the way, she makes statements about women's rights in general. For example, she found that halacha included no isur, no prohibition on teaching women Jewish law. Knowing that the rabbis claimed women cannot judge over the people, she countered by saying, quote, "It is my humble opinion that all the opposing responsa failed to reconcile successfully the unalterable and glaring biblical example of Deborah." In other words, it's very nice to say that women cannot judge, but we have the glaring example of Deborah trump that. And indeed, in my responsum on women rabbis in this volume, when I talk about women as dayanim, as judges, I refer to Deborah and all of the poskim who use that as a precedent for saying whether women can or cannot be judges. In any case, she writes the thesis, and then it's 1939, and the question is, are they going to ordain her, or are they not going to ordain her? So, first of all, her father, Rabbi Israel Leventhal, a very famous rabbi, Brooklyn Jewish Center, decides to give her a bit of encouragement. He invites her to preach on Shabbat at his synagogue. And you have to understand that Rabbi Israel Leventhal was not just any old preacher. He was one of the big guns, right? He was a very famous preacher in the 1930s. I have in my office a volume of his sermons, which are still quite good until today. And he invites her to preach, and he had the habit of giving himself grades on his own sermons. So he invites his daughter to preach, Helen Leventhal, March of 1939, and she gives a sermon called "The Jewish Woman Faces a New World from his Bima." Her father gave her the grade, "Most excellent, 100++. I imagine, like most fathers, he wasn't exactly objective. So then they have to decide what degrees are they going to give her. She's been studying there for 7 years. So they're going to give her the Master of Hebrew Literature. Her classmates, all of the men, were opposed. A full year before she would complete her studies, the junior class petitioned Rabbi Wise and the faculty, occasioned by the fact that one member of the class is a woman and maybe graduated in 1939 either as a rabbi or a master of Hebrew literature or both. The 10 young men, including future Rabbi Earlstone, unanimously agreed that the, quote, presence of a woman in the group will detract from the dignity and force of our ordination into the ministry as rabbis in Israel. While we do not necessarily believe that the opportunity for study and acquisition of the MHL degree should be denied to a member of the female sex, They wanted her diploma conferred in a separate ceremony. Right? In other words, they didn't even know yet whether she would be ordained as a rabbi. Even for the MHL, they wanted it given in a separate ceremony because they felt that if it was given together with them, it would harm their careers as rabbis. Rabbi Weiss and the faculty demurred, refusing to prevent any candidate who fulfilled degree requirements from appearing at commencement. Subsequently, in June of 1939, Helen Leventhal graduated from the Jewish Institute of Religion. Both her father, and I forgot to mention her grandfather, was a very famous Orthodox rabbi. Both of them attended the ceremony at which Weiss conferred upon the men of the senior class, the degree of MHL and rabbi. To Helen Leventhal, he granted 2 diplomas. One in English, verifying her Master of Hebrew Literature, and a special certificate in Hebrew proposed by Rabbi Leventhal, but most likely written by Professor Chernovitz. Weiss had once told Leventhal that Chernovitz conceded that a new title could be conferred upon a woman, since the Hebrew title Rav was masculine. The Hebrew diploma bestowed upon Chava Hadassah, Bat Harav Yisrael Chaim Leventhal, gave her the title of Musmacha. Musmacha, not Musmach, but Musmacha, which is of course feminine. Certified in Sifrut Yisrael, thus echoing in the feminine the Hebrew term Musmach of rabbinic ordination. So you can debate, was she ordained as a rabbi or wasn't she ordained as a rabbi? She was not ordained as a Rav, she was ordained as a Musmacha. That's what it said in her Hebrew certificate. In Musmach means, it's from the word smicha. Now, interestingly enough, I'll just tell you a little vignette. Is Linda still here? No. We recently sent out a notice, this coming Sunday night, in a few days, we're having our MA graduation here in the courtyard. 100 people are receiving their MA degrees in Jewish Studies here at Schichter. So we sent out an invitation in Hebrew, and it said, Shashana yiyu tishim ushmona musmachim. We said there would be 98 musmachim. So I get an email from a rabbi, and she says, why are you calling MA graduates musmachim? Well, if you open up Evan Shoshan's Hebrew dictionary, which is a standard Hebrew dictionary, look up the word musmach, you will find that musmach is used for a person who has an MA degree. Right? So in modern Hebrew, musmach means you have an MA degree. It's the degree you get after Torah Rishon. But obviously in 1939 that was not the case. He was calling her musmacha not because she had received an MHL, but because he was trying to find another term for rabbi. We have 10 minutes left and 2 episodes. We will scale back to the 1920s and 1930s, and now we're going back to Germany. Most of the stories I told you took place in the United States. Ironically enough, one of the first women to be ordained as a rabbi was a German Reform rabbi. And her name was Regina Jonas, Rabbi Regina Jonas. And the reason I Xeroxed her picture here, I have pictures of all the people we discussed this afternoon. I Xeroxed her picture because she was killed in the Holocaust at Auschwitz. And I think it's very important that we remember not only what she did, but also what she looked like. Rabbi Regina Jonas studied at the Hochschule in Berlin, which was the Reform Rabbinical Seminary, which was a very well-known institution in the late 19th and early 20th century until it was destroyed by the Nazis, Yimach Shmam, in the Holocaust. And she studied at the Hochschule from 1924 until 1930. And she wrote her senior thesis, obviously in German, on can a woman hold rabbinical office? And we are lucky that a few years ago this book appeared. It's in the bibliography that I gave you. The book is called Fraulein Rabbiner Jonas, the story of the first woman rabbi. And the scholar who published this book, the entire second half of the book is a translation of Rabbi Regina Jonas's thesis. Now, she translated the thesis from German into English so that most people can read it. A very learned thesis on whether women can serve as a rabbi, which of course had lain in a typescript until it was published in this book. So she writes the thesis in 1930, and she wrote the thesis for Rabbi Professor Edward Bannett, who was a very well-known rabbi and scholar at the time, teaching at the Hochschule. And it was approved by Rabbi Bannett, but in order to receive ordination from the Hochschule, which was a reform rabbinical seminary, you needed an oral exam administered by a Talmud professor. Professor Bannett passes away. He was a Talmud professor. There was no other Talmud professor at the Hochschule who was willing to ordain Rabbi Jonas as a rabbi. So here she was. She had completed her thesis with a Talmud professor. Her advisor passed away. And by the way, this happens at universities as well. If somebody writes a dissertation, their advisor passes away and the student is stuck. So she writes the dissertation, she's ready to be ordained, and her advisor passes away, and none of the other Talmud professors, including Professor Hanoch Albeck, who wrote this classic commentary on the Mishnah, Professor Albeck did not agree that a woman could be ordained as a rabbi. So she didn't know what to do. Eventually, she was referred to Rabbi Max Dienemann, who was a well-known Reform rabbi in Germany at the time. And in 1935, Rabbi Max Dienemann gave her private smicha as a rabbi. And the amazing thing is that despite the Holocaust, we have her smicha certificate. It's the Xerox in front of you. And this is what it says. Habetula Reina, Hamechuna Regina, the young woman, which literally would be virgin, the young woman Reina, who is called Regina, daughter of Ze'ev, Jonas, I'm going to translate this directly into English because we don't have time, studied in our Beit Midrash for Wissenschaft des Judentums in Berlin from 1924 until 1930. And then she was tested in the various areas of Jewish studies, and Amda b'nisayon. She passed the test. And our teacher, Rabbi Yecheskel Bannett, told her to write a chibur, to write a dissertation on the subject, whether women may be given the title of rabbi, and she wrote it under his direction, and she did not stop teaching, and Rabbi Bannett agreed that according to halacha, she can be counted among the rabbis, and he started to give her an exam panim el panim, in person, but before the exam was finished, nikra lamarom ve'alach lolamo. He was called to the Heavenly Academy. He passed away. And now she comes on behalf of the Liberal Rabbis Organization in Germany, and I tested her, and I know that she can study, and she knows to laset v'latet bidvar halacha. She knows to discuss halachic issues, la'amid din al shorsho, to set the law by its roots, meaning to delve into the origin of a law in Judaism. And after I understood that her heart is with God and with Israel, and that she gave her soul for the goal for which she intended, that she is a fearer of God. And notice that he writes Elokim and not Elohim. She passed the test that I gave her in halacha. I testify about her that she can answer questions in Jewish law, and that she can be counted on the among the those who hold the office of rabbi, and may God support her and be with her in everything that she does. The first day of Tevet Tafresh Tzadik Vav, Meir Dinama. A beautiful document. Rabbi Jonas proceeded to become a teacher in Israel, meaning in the Jewish people, She taught in various institutions in Germany. Unfortunately, she was taken to Theresienstadt in 1942. There are many beautiful stories about her activities at Theresienstadt, the way that she helped people both from a Jewish point of view and in terms of moral support. She was deported to Auschwitz in the last transport from Theresienstadt, where she was killed together with millions of other Jews. May her memory be for a blessing. The last episode, of course, is the episode of Rabbi Sally Preisand, who is the first Reform rabbi ordained by HUC in Cincinnati. In Professor Nadel's book, that episode takes 60 pages. I'm not going to try and summarize the 60 pages because we don't have time. But basically, Rabbi Preisand decided when she was a teenager in the 1960s, when she was 16 years old, that she wanted to become a rabbi. It took a long time and a lot of effort, but she was eventually ordained as a rabbi by HUC in Cincinnati in 1972. I would like to conclude by 4 general observations about this process, or these examples. Number 1, we have seen that this was a very long and drawn-out process. We started out in 1825. We ended up in 1972. Social changes in general, and certainly in Judaism, usually take a long time. The second observation is that of the 11 women that I wanted to discuss this morning, I didn't get to all 11 of them, of the 11 women that I wanted to discuss, 4 of them were either wives or daughters of rabbis. Okay? You can draw whatever conclusion you want from that, but that is a fact. Number 3, ironically, we had here 2 examples of women rabbis, Orthodox women rabbis, before we had any examples of conservative or Reform or Reconstructionist women rabbis. So that is why I started out by mentioning that 3 Orthodox women were ordained 5 days ago. It's a long time between the Maid of Ludimir and the Maharat Institute in New York, almost 200 years. But the first 2 women rabbis were Orthodox women. And finally, many people view this women's ordination as an American phenomenon. That's not really true. The reason it's an American phenomenon is because of the Holocaust. We don't know what would have happened in Europe had the Holocaust not transpired. I imagine that Rabbi Regina Jonas, of blessed memory, would have been the first of many women to be ordained as a rabbi. That process was frozen by the Holocaust and only resumed some 40 years later in the United States. That's what I wanted to present this morning. I'm sorry we didn't have more time. Toda rabba.